Hey, what's up guys, Pablander here and welcome back to this mini workshop on the Adobe 3D tools in action. So in this video, we're gonna wrap up the material creation before we move into a Substance 3D Painter. Let's go ahead and jump straight into it. All right, so here we are in 3D Sampler. This is where we left off. We built this kind of like copper material for, let me bring in the reference, for this type of thing. So this is what we were trying to achieve in the previous video. And now we're gonna concentrate on the bottle and the bowl. Well, kind of like it's more like a dish or the bowl and the jug, these two elements. Now the materials are pretty simple. In fact, they're gonna be based on a single color probably. So the material itself is pretty simple, but I left it to the end because it's more complex the way that we're gonna set it up. And when I say complex, I don't mean it's gonna be super different from what we've been doing. It's just that I'm gonna use a couple more things in Substance 3D Sampler that I haven't shown you so far that probably require a little bit more of a setup, but that's about it. It's exactly the same thing. So let's go ahead and jump straight into it. I'm gonna click on Project, click on New Material, and let's go ahead and right click and rename this Terracotta Clay. Right, so this is gonna be for the bowl. All right, so let's go ahead and create the ceramic first, like the base material. So I have a bunch of images in here that I've collected. So I think we've used this one before. So now I'm gonna use something like this, or even this one might be interesting. Yeah, let's go ahead and use this as a starting point. Again, you can use anything that you like. So I'm gonna use this, drop it in there, select image to material. Perfect. And because the one that I selected is quite elongated, so the format, the aspect ratio is quite tall, I'm going to use the transform straight away just to make this look better. So let's click on Add Layer, Transform, and let's just push that one up. And I'm using like high-res images, so I'm not too worried about scaling this too much. There we go. Let's go to Base Material. Let's go to the Height. Set this to 0.2, sorry, 0.1, much better. Displacement 0.1. And don't worry about like the intensity of all this. It might be a little bit too intense or it might not be, but all of that can be tweaked from Substance 3D Painter very easily. As long as the material looks good in here, that's all we care about at this stage. All right, so another thing is, let's jump into the ambient occlusion. This one is pretty strong. As you can see, they have like a pretty noisy or dirty surface. So let's go ahead and select the image to material now. Let's go to the ambient occlusion strength and we can reduce this quite a bit. There we go. So it's a little bit cleaner. We can also play around with the micro details and the medium details. So something that we did as well in the past. So all of that nice porosity in the normal map, I want to enhance that a bit more using the micro details, but I want to reduce probably the medium and the large detail. Let's go to the height map to see that. I'm going to reduce that a little bit more, kind of like equalizing those details a bit more. And I'm doing all of this because this is going to be a relatively flat material. The bumps and the pattern that we're going to create, that's going to be with a different tool or a different effect here within the layer stack. But we're going to get to that. So this is kind of like the initial setup. You can also play around with the geometry equalize so that it's not as strong the difference. And of course, go to the roughness. And I'm going to go for a lower value here so that it's a bit more reflective, maybe not that much. Something like this, and let's increase the softness and the variation. So the variation softness and the variations in the roughness. And we can probably do with a bit more of the albedo importance, so the details of the albedo. All right, so that's starting to look all right. And the next thing we need to do is make a tile, right? Because these ones are pretty obvious, the seams in here. So let's click on tile, or tiling, sorry. Click on tiling. That should give us a good starting point. I can reduce that box a bit more. And you see that there is a pretty bright area here and a pretty dark one. That is something that we can arrange or fix with the transform. Just trying to find an area that's more consistent from that image. All right, I think a little bit better there. And with the tiling, again, we can click on edge and we can play around with the threshold of that edge. I want to go for a lower value so that we have like a lot of kind of like this this light area sort of creeping through a bit randomly, kind of like a warp effect, and add a bit of blurriness as well, and softness. All right, so that already gives us a pretty good starting point for that tiling, and we can also obviously change that box a bit, the tiling box. Alrighty, that's pretty good. Okay, and I quite like this like harsh detail, although it's gonna be pretty obvious in the tiling, so maybe let's move that out of the way. All right. If you want to keep it, or if you feel like this works better, in fact, let's just do that. If you feel like this works a bit better in this area, we can use something that I mentioned in the previous video, which is the clone stamp, to remove that bit. So we can hold the Alt key around maybe, or just move it, actually. Let's move it here, and then just paint that. And that sort of like fixes that a little bit. And now we can bring in the make it tile just to wrap up this effect. So I'm going a little bit faster here because I've already mentioned all of those things in previous videos. So the make it tile, it's almost like, it's hard to see. It's still here, but we can play around with the threshold and the smoothness of that threshold. If you think about it, the make it tile is almost like tweaking a triplanar projection. So that's what I'm trying to focus on. It reduces the contrast as well. There we go. All right. So now this is a pretty nice and tileable material. Again, this still doesn't look like the ceramic that I'm trying to create, but it's a good starting point. We have a nice variation of color and brightness in the image. So now we can concentrate on making it look more like what we want it to. So let's bring in a colorize. Again, we've used this one in the past as well, just to give us the starting point of the color. So this is going to be a terracotta type of orangey tone, a bit more desaturated, something like that. We have something pretty similar as an alternative from that blue ceramic that we did before, but this is going to be slightly different. You'll see why. All right, so now we have something a lot closer to the material that we are after for this mesh or for this object, right? So I have some reference in here. These are a lot more polished than what I'm after. So I think I want to go for something more like that, a bit more rough. But all of these details, we can do without. I just want to keep it simple and have like a plain material, something like that, but with this color, right? So just want to show you where what I'm aiming for. So that's looking good. So the next thing I want to do is bring in the height and then the normal and height adjustment. So we can play around a little bit more with the intensity of the normals, because it is a bit too much to my taste. So let's see, turn on and off. Yeah, a lot better. All right. Now this next step is where things get a bit more interesting, not complicated. I keep using the word advanced or complicated, but it's not really. Anything with this software is actually pretty simple. So I'm going to click on Add Layer, and I'm going to click on Pattern, or Type Pattern. So this one right here, Pattern, click on that. That's going to give us a very simple pattern that we can edit, which is pretty cool. So by default, it's set to square. We can click on square and just go for stripe bold, dot matrix. A lot of different cool effects that you can create just by switching this. And you can also increase the tiling of that pattern. You can rotate that pattern around. So very, very flexible. So what I want to do is actually create my own pattern. So let's set this to squares. I think it was the original. Let's just set it to stripe medium. It doesn't really matter. Once we add our custom pattern, it should be fine. So the pattern could be anything as long as it's tiling, and that's the important part. So you can do that in Photoshop. You can create your own material or your own pattern. But what I've done is in ZBrush, I created a custom pattern that you can download as well, which is this one. So I created a height map, or like an alpha map in ZBrush, to create this sort of like stripy lines to make it feel like the ceramic is not completely polished or completely finished. So I have that alpha that I exported from ZBrush, and it's a tileable alpha. So this is what I'm going to use as a pattern, but you can use anything that you want as long as it's styling, or ideally as long as it's styling. Or you can use this pattern, which is provided in the resources for this workshop as well. So let's go back into 3D Sampler. Here we go. And in the bottom, or towards the bottom of pattern, we have this custom pattern. So I'm going to click on custom pattern, and everything disappears because we don't have any custom pattern. But once you enable this, you will see that the custom pattern section is available. So in here, you can literally just go ahead and paint it if you wanted to, but I'm just going to drag and drop. Let me show you what I'm going to do. So here is the custom pattern that is in the resources. So I'm going to click and drag and drop that in there. And now we have a pattern in there. So I'm going to change the color to something closer to that terracotta that I'm setting up anyway. Almost like hiding it, but adding a tiny bit of variation, which is cool. Right. Now that's done, but that's obviously not what we want. So we want this pattern to actually affect the height and the normal. So if we go to the pattern details, scroll that down, you'll see we have the blurriness, we have the metallic, the normal, and all of that. So what I want to do is override the material details a little bit. So if I push this all the way to 1, you'll see that the pattern, or the areas, the lighter areas of my custom pattern are kind of like a bit more polished, and they're overriding, or it's overriding some of the details of the original material. That's exactly what we want, right? But maybe a bit more subtle. So again, you can just push things all the way to see what they do. Same thing with the blurriness, right? And then just knock it down a little bit. So I think that's what we want. But now we can go ahead and override the pattern normal. So we can enable that. And now we're starting to get a bit more of that nice, brushy, I don't know exactly how to describe the pattern, but it's like a stripy pattern, right? And we can override the entire normals, so that this is pretty strong, or not at all, right? So this is what I like about being able to control things from different sliders. So I think I'm going to go for something pretty obvious. Override that material as well, and sorry, the details a bit more, and add a bit of blurriness to the pattern. All right, I think that works. So this is looking pretty good. And we can just go ahead and finalize this material with a couple more things. So let's click on Add Layer, and let's go to Dust. We've used this one in the past as well. And we're going to add some dust in some of those crevices as well. One more thing that I forgot. Let's just actually remove dust for the time being. Right now, this effect that you can see here, this stripy effect from the pattern, that's actually in the normal map, right? Because that's what the pattern is doing. So if I go to the normal map, this is what we get from the normal. But in the hide map, we don't have anything like that. And this kind of like seam that you see here is not very obvious anyway, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. But if you wanted to, you can go back to the make it tile and fix it. But anyway, this the stripy pattern is not as obvious in the hide map, whereas in the normal map is pretty sharp. Right? So one thing we can do as well in order to use that information of the normal but push things, like displacing things with the hide map, is to convert the normal to the hide. So we can click on Add Layer, go normal, so normal to hide, this one right here. And that's just going to take the normal and is going to push it into the hide map. Now, the only problem with this one, and this is what I'm going to show you, is that if I turn this on and off, it's actually pushing everything, not just the pattern, right? It's pushing those points and those details. So just wanted to show you that you can also do that and play around with this additional effect that converts or takes the normal information and converts it to a hide map. In this case, it's not necessarily what I need. So let's go to dust, add a bit of dust. And in the dust one, let's go ahead and increase the intensity again, just so we can see more of it. And we're going to remove the cavities, or actually increase the cavities. Play around with the noise transition and remove a bit of the contrast as well. All right, so this is basically what the dust is doing, is trying to target those crevices, which is perfectly fine. And we can remove the amount of dust. So I just want to have a little bit of dust in between. kind of like an old piece of ceramic. That's the idea here. Actually, maybe remove the noise. And at this point, what I like to do is just go back and forth between, let's say, density, the contrast of the transition, and figure out like a good balance between all of these lighters. So at the end, when I'm finished with dust, you can go ahead and copy these values, but I would suggest to just go through the process of tweaking things like I'm doing here, just little by little, see what they do, come back and, play around with the roughness of that dust, remove the density, and maybe just play with the opacity as well. All right, so I think this one is looking all right. So that's kind of like what I'm after. One more thing that I want to do just to damage this a bit more is to bring in the scratches, right? So let's bring in the scratches. This is something that we did at the end of the metallic surface as well. And it's going to be pretty hard to see in this specific material, but I'm going to turn off scratches and micro scratches, which are the ones that we use in the previous material, in the metallic one, but I'm going to enable chips, and that's going to give me another level of complexity to this material. So let's increase the amount so that you can see clearly, and the intensity, so you can see what I'm doing. There we go. So those are the chips of this material, and that kind of like works really well for this type of like old, ceramics with some chipped areas. And we can also go to the advanced parameters, and we can change the roughness value, because right now they like very different. If you go to the roughness, you can see these are very different. So we can change the roughness value so that they are pretty, pretty reflective, which is not what I want. I want the opposite. I want something even less, right? And you can also add a bit of color to it. So maybe like the inside of that ceramic is slightly lighter, kind of like the same color, maybe more desaturated. These are the type of things that I can kind of spend, a lot of time just fine tuning. But if you have like real references, that makes it a lot easier, because you're just trying to match the reference. I don't exactly have a reference of the material that I'm trying to build. These ones are kind of like the closest thing that I found to what I wanted. But as a base, this is working fine. All right, so you see those chipped areas in that material, that gives it another level of realism, and that's with the scratching, right? We can also increase the intensity of the normal, so it's a lot stronger than that. I think it's fine as it is. We can change the flatness of that chip area, but I think again, it's just a matter of playing around with those sliders and see what they give you. Maybe the intensity of the normal is too much. There we go. And also we can play with the roughness value one more time, so it's not as rough. All right. So now that I can sort of like tweak exactly what the chipped areas are, or how they look, I can go back to the level and the amount, or the intensity and the amount of these chips. So I can remove that a little bit. There we go. And the intensity as well if you wanted to. And the scale, but I think the scale is fine. Yeah, the scale is fine. So now I have those chipped areas in the material. Let me turn that on and off. So it does help quite a bit. And if you wanted to, you can put that below dust so that those areas can also collect dust. And we just need to tweak the kind of like the density of that layer a little bit, just because we added a kind of like another level of of like height and normal, so we have to tweak that a little bit. But this is more realistic, right? So that the dust, if we have those scratches or those cracks, this actually makes sense that the dust is collected in those areas. All right, so that's pretty much it. Cool. So let's go ahead and go to project. Actually, let's save things first. And for the final material, which is the one that we're going to use for the jug, is going to be pretty similar, but we're going to do a couple of things. So we're going to right click and duplicate this material, and we're going to call it black ceramic. All right, so we're going to use pretty much everything that we've used in this material, but we're going to add a bit more, maybe more damage or more complexity to it. with different things that we can add. So the first thing is going to decolorize, and I want to make this a dark ceramic. So desaturated, almost black. Click OK. And in the pattern, we also have to update that pattern color, something like that. And of course, the scratch. Let's go to the advanced parameters, color, and let's make this. You know what? We can actually leave it like this color, almost like this. This is like a painted color on top of the actual ceramic underneath, or like the clay underneath. But what we can do is change the amount of scratches and that sort of thing. So of chips, sorry. So less intense, and maybe increase the scale a little bit. No, I think it's fine. All right, so it's a bit more subtle, right? Another thing we can do is let's turn off the dust for the time being, and let's go ahead and click on Add Layer. So I'm going to type cracks, and cracks are slightly different than scratches. So I'm going to click on cracks, and that's going to give me like a cracked version of this ceramic, which is roughly what I want. We can tweak all of these as well. So let's go to the spread, and we're going to remove some of the damaged details and remove the amounts. I don't want that many cracks in the ceramic, just a tiny bit that we can play around with later on in Substance Painter. Although this is the type of details that you can do directly in Substance 3D Painter rather than do it directly in the material. But I just want to show you, if you want to do a base material that has that, you can totally do it from here. So let's do that, and let's go to cracks. The color of the crack will be probably similar to that base orangey desaturated color. There we go. The roughness, just gonna make it pretty rough. What else? Let's see. The intensity in the on the height map, I think maybe we can reduce that a bit more, so that is not as strong. And we can go to the advanced parameters of this and just play around with the normal. So the intensity of the normal, so it's not as strong. And the way that you can sort of tell what the difference between the normal and the height map is, so the height map is going to push the entire crack, right? So the entire thing is going to be very, very strong. So let's just leave it as 1 for the time being. And the normal is going to tweak the amount of details, right? So we can play around with those two values, again, just to try to find some balance in there. Alrighty, so that's just a very simple addition, very simple tweak to the material that makes it look a bit more damaged and interesting. And we can put that below dust again, turn that on, and we can go ahead and tweak the dust. So let's reduce the density of the dust as well. Now, aside from the cracks and the color of this material, it is pretty similar to the previous one, right? So what I want to do is two things. I want to varnish it, and then I want to add some smudges, like if someone has been handling this material, so it leaves some of the fingerprints in there. So I'm going to click on Add Layer, and I'm going to type varnish. Here we go. And that gives it a nice thick layer of varnish on top of everything. Of course, certain things that don't make sense because we have cracks and all of this dust and everything below this varnish, but all we have to do is just do this, just bring it below the cracks and the dust and everything, and we have something pretty convincing. Of course, this varnish can be tweaked a lot more, so we can change the coating, the thickness of the coat. Sorry, let's move that to 0. So the thinner this coating of this varnish is, the more of the smaller details that you would see from the previous material, from the previous set of layers, right? We can also increase the roughness. There we go. So it's a lot better. Let's turn off varnish. So this is what we had before. Now we have a layer of varnish that sort of unify the details a bit more. But we have that below the cracks and the dust and all of that. So that's pretty cool. And to finalize it, let's go ahead and do the same thing between varnish and the rest of these details. Let's type smudge, I think it is. Yep, smudge and stain. So this is kind of like you have the little icon making reference of that sort of, smudging from with the fingers. So I'm going to click on that. and put that below scratch. And let's go ahead and turn this off as well, just so that it renders faster what we're trying to do. So you see this is mostly targeting kind of like the roughness. So let's go ahead and play with the intensity just to make sure that we can see it clearly. Maybe let's go ahead and change. Right now, these are fingerprints and handprints. That's what you can see in there, but they're like huge. So we can go to advanced parameters and finger and handprints, and we can play with the size. So you can go for larger handprints, and I'm not sure if the handprints are going to work actually. So let's go ahead and change the intensity, continue working on that. I might change the handprint. So I don't know if the handprints are actually going to work. So I'm going to remove that by changing the intensity or the density, sorry, of the handprint, and just concentrate on the fingerprint intensity. So let's add more intensity. And I keep saying intensity. I mean the density is the amount, right? So how many of these fingerprints there are. The size, that could actually be increased a bit more, but I don't want to have them all over the place. I just want tiny bits. And let's reduce the intensity now. All right. I'm not going to try to make them as perfect as, like as readable as a fingerprint, because ultimately this material and these lines are not going to be as big. And if we leave these smudges from the material, then it's going to be pretty easy to determine the size on the scale. And if you make this very, very small, and then you end up with these smudges that are pretty, tiny or pretty big, it's not going to make sense once you put in the material. And all of this that I'm saying is going to make more sense when we get to Substance Painter, but you can totally do the same thing in Substance 3D Painter. So I'm going to turn this on and off to see the difference. This is still very, very subtle. You can also add the liquid stain. So if I enable this, you'll see this pattern coming through, and that changes things quite a bit, but it's pretty fun to play around with as well. So let's go ahead and collapse this and go to liquid stains, and we can play with intensity. And because this is the material that I'm going to use for the bottle, it kind of like makes sense that, either water or whatever whatever is in the jug, you have the stains in here. So I'm going to change the drop size and the intensity as well, sorry, the opacity as well. And this is one of the things that I really like about this, that everything is, is very easy to change. It's just you can see in real time what you're doing. So even if you don't know exactly what these sliders do, which often I forget about what they do, I just need to go back and tweak and change the effect to see what they're doing. It's very easy. So I kind of like this effect. I'm gonna maybe reduce the amount of the drops, and maybe reduce the the density of the licks as well, and increase the width a bit more. So hopefully you can see what I'm trying to achieve here. And we can go here at the bottom. You can make things metallic, if you want to play around a little bit more with this. But I think overall, I'm happy with this, and we can play with the roughness as well. Yeah, I think I'm happy with this. Let's go ahead and turn on the scratches, the cracks, and dust. Right. All right. So now that I turned this on, I realize, like, if this was the actual in real life, right, the water will just go through the cracks, and these stains won't be as perfect or like straight. So maybe they don't make a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and reduce those and play around with the opacity. Maybe something like a bit more subtle. And the same thing with the drops. Maybe play around with the size a bit more, so we see more of these drops. Play around with the opacity and reduce the intensity. So again, like I've been repeating myself, but with materials, it's all about the subtlety of the details. And that's it. I'm not entirely like mad happy about the cracks, so we can just turn that off. Yeah, I think I'm not gonna keep the cracks, but we can do two materials. That's the beauty of it, right? So let's go back to varnish. I'm gonna add a bit more roughness to it. There we go. And let's go to the project. This is done. This is finished. I'm gonna right click and I'm gonna duplicate it. And I'm gonna call it black ceramic and no cracks. so that we have the ability to play around with two different materials later on. So let's turn cracks off and go to dust and adjust dust. Obviously, the dust is going to change. This effect is going to change because we are removing the cracks. All right, so let's select dust and let's add density to it. Not too bad. Okay, so we can also go to the varnish, and just because this is slightly different than the other material, we can enhance that a bit more, maybe adding a bit more thickness to that coating to reduce that the amount of little details from the normal. There we go. Maybe add a bit more roughness to it, just a tiny bit. So basically we have like two different materials to play around with. And if anything, maybe this could be the polished material. So let's take the scratch and go to chips and maybe reduce the amount of chips. So it's just less of that damage. All right, so that concludes this first stage of the workshop, which is essentially creating the materials. Now we're going to move on into Substance 3D Painter, and we're going to put them all together, making use of the assets that I provided and these custom materials that we've been creating. So I'll see you in the next video.